So now we've got to get into some poems that are a little bit more experimental, maybe a little bit more conceptually complicated than the other ones, which have been maybe a little bit more on the narrative side. Sometimes poems can seem almost just like little super ultra concise stories. Sometimes, in fact, they seem like a whole different art form altogether, something a little bit richer, a little bit more difficult, a little bit more requiring interpretation. So the first of these poems that we're going to look at is called Little Fugue by Frank Bidart. This poem came out in 2005. It was interesting because it was originally part of a chapbook called Music Like Dirt. That is, a chapbook is just sort of a short version of a book. It's like, you know, an EP in music is a shorter version of an LP. And it, as a chapbook, is the only chapbook in history to be nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. So this is definitely, you know, acclaimed work, and it is also very complicated work. It ultimately was compiled in the book Stardust, which is a fantastic piece of literature, very profound and brilliant. So this little poem, Little Fugue, is a profoundly complicated piece of work. It has a lot going on with it, a lot of repetition, and probably, you know, there's a decent chance that you read through it the first time and you finish it and you're like, what the heck is this guy talking about? So it really does get into this idea of the richness of metaphor, the idea of a poem as a meditative event. It forces you to ask a lot of questions, such as, for example, what is this ticket that's being talked about? You know, so it says, at birth you were handed a ticket. Beneath every journey, the ticket to this journey in one direction. And then again later, you are handed a ticket, indecipherable rectangle forgotten in your pocket. So you have to ask yourself, what is this ticket that's being talked about? And there are a lot of possible things, but in many ways you can consider that it means, you know, the ticket is the ticket to the future, the ticket to our eventual death. That ultimately, all of us, when we are born, we are handed this ticket, this thing that is going to ultimately take us somewhere, and we don't necessarily know what that is, because it says indecipherable rectangle forgotten in your pocket, that it's something that we carry with us, something that we were given at birth, but we kind of forget about it when we're living our lives, even though all along this ticket has been there, and we need to take the ride that it wants us to take. It also, in addition to the ticket metaphor, presents the metaphor of life as a conveyor belt, moving in one direction, slower or swifter than sight, a moving walkway, as if all you fear is losing your balance, moving in one direction. So we have this idea of also life as a conveyor belt, something that we're moving along, something that's you know, taking us with it, and we don't necessarily know that we're on it, but we know that we don't want to lose our balance. So it is very difficult. It's a poem where the direct referent, the conveyor belt, the ticket, are things that ultimately aren't really what the poem is about. Those things are just vehicles. They're metaphors to give us a way of talking about something far more complex. So in a lot of ways, this is a poem deserving of substantial study, something where you can read it a number of times, consider how it relates necessarily to our lives. And then, on top of that, we have the issue of the title, which is a very, very complicated thing, and really ratchets up the complexity of this work to a whole different level. So, a fugue, it has a couple different meanings. One is it is a musical term based on a type of composition in which multiple themes are enunciated or announced by several voices in turn. So you see how this poem does that, right? Because it goes from the ticket to the conveyor belt and back to the ticket and then back to the conveyor belt / walkway and then back to the ticket. So it very much has this to it. It's kind of an incantation. It has these themes and they are being done by several voices. But that's the less interesting of the possible interpretations of the title Little Fugue, because a fugue is also defined as a period of loss of memory, oftentimes in which somebody can begin a new life, and then in which they don't remember the previous life, and then if they recover, they don't remember anything of the period when they had amnesia. So a fugue is kind of an active blank spot. You know, a fugue is a situation in which you are living something, but you do not remember the life that came before, and then when that new life is over, you know, you don't remember ever having lived it. So it's a weird sort of thing. So here is the mind-blowing part, that our whole life is a little fugue. Okay, think about that. Our whole life is a little fugue. Okay, so we're given this ticket, right? We're on this conveyor belt, we're moving towards death. The ticket represents the future and our eventual demise, right? Okay, so if our whole life is a fugue, you think of the life as the fugue state in which while we are living, we do not remember the period of being that took place before we were alive, right? We don't remember anything like a past life or, you know, what happened before we were born. But then, boom, when we die, it's as if this period of amnesia that we are having right now, this fugue state of our lives, is something that is something that we don't remember, that we are now living a life much like the one that we lived potentially before we were born, and that we are in a whole new sort of emptiness, a whole new sort of place of contentment or bliss or, you know, darkness, however you would like to interpret that, but that the life that we lived, it being a fugue, was something that we did not remember. So you can see how this is a complicated piece of work, and you can see how something like this would be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It's very rich, it's very complicated, it's something that you have to spend some time with, because if you just try to, you know, go through it in a hurry, you're not going to get everything that you need to get from it. And that brings us to the second poem of this session, which is a poem by Mary Ruefle, who is a truly fantastic and fascinating poet in mind, who writes essays, she writes things in prose, she's written many books of poetry, and this little piece of work, From a Little White Shadow, is something that's a little bit different. It came out in 2006, and it's actually what she calls a book of erasure. And basically in which she erases things from a pre-existing text until she ends up with just what's left over. This has also been called stuff like, you know, blackout poetry, for instance. This book, A Little White Shadow, the original version was a forgotten 19th century text that nobody cared about anymore, and Ruefle ended up finding it, going through it with some whiteout paint and blacking things out until she only had left these few words. So even though it ends up being very haunted by the original draft, she ends up with something entirely new and something entirely rich. 7 centuries of sobbing gathered in the twilight and had their pages wandered through. Right? There's a beauty to that, right? 7 centuries of sobbing gathered in the twilight and had their pages wandered through. You hear that rhythm again? You know, that rhythm that we talked about before? It's in there, even though this originally was prose. By cutting things out of it, Ruefle has turned it into a poem. And then, the dead borrow so little from the past as if they were alive. There's a lot of profundity to that, right? You can see kind of how it relates to Little Fugue by Bidart. It's sort of a, you know, mesmerizing little situation in which we get this idea that the dead borrow nothing from the past, you know, as if they were alive, because as we are alive, we are also limited in what we borrow from the past. So there's a lot going on here, and it's an example of how when you read the poem aloud, you can come up with something truly beautiful, something terrifying, something maybe a little bit haunting and mystifying, and something that you need to, you know, work with. So both of these poems, Little Fugue and, you know, From a Little White Shadow, demonstrate, you know, a new type of experimentation that can happen in contemporary literature. something where you can push the limit on meaning a little bit more. You can find new methods, and I encourage you wholly to try to write stuff like this yourself. Try to get out there. Try to, write stuff that's going to challenge other people's conception. By all means, go grab a book off your shelf and try to, do some erasure. Try to create a work of art from another work of art and see what you can come up with. If you really try to expand your mind and really try to come up with some good art, it'll be amazing what you can discover.